In this video, we are going to start talking about the respiratory system. Specifically, we're going to look at the function of the respiratory system and what it is doing for your body. So, like all systems of the body, the respiratory system is going to be very interrelated, and other systems are going to depend on it. However, we can divide the processes of respiration into really four different categories. So these four processes include pulmonary ventilation, which is what you typically think of as breathing. Pulmonary gas exchange, the transport of respiratory gases, and then tissue gas exchange. So pulmonary ventilation is going to involve inspiration, that is the movement of air into the lungs from the atmosphere, and expiration, which is the movement of air out of the lungs into the atmosphere. So essentially you're going to be breathing in oxygen-rich air and breathing out carbon dioxide-rich air. And so it's really just looking at how these two things are going to be exchanged. The next type of, or next process in respiration is external respiration. So now we're talking about what's actually going on with the air that has gone into the lungs. So air has gone into the lungs. O2, rich air from the atmosphere, is going to then have its O2 diffuse from the lungs into the blood, while the CO2 from metabolism is going to diffuse from the blood into the lungs. So this process is going to involve the movement of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide can be present in a number of different ways. So you can have it as the CO2 dissolved in the plasma. It can also be carbon dioxide that's stored as bicarbonate ion, carried by the glucose or by the hemoglobin in blood as well. So the CO2 is ultimately, you're having a reaction here that's moving in both directions, and so the CO2 is going to ultimately diffuse out of the blood, while oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood. Some of it will dissolve, but the vast majority of it will be attached to hemoglobin that you find in your red blood cells. The O2 solubility and the CO2 solubility are going to be different from each other, but because the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is going to be much higher than it is for the carbon dioxide, it's going to result in similar concentrations that are diffusing. All right, the next thing that's going on in respiration is the transport of respiratory gases. So the cardiovascular system is going to transport high concentrations of O2 from the lungs to the tissue cells of the body, and it's going to carry high concentrations of CO2 from the tissue cells of the body back to the lungs for that external respiration to occur. Some of this was alluded to in the previous process, but how carbon dioxide is transported is going to be variable. So about 7 to 10% of it is going to be as dissolved carbon dioxide in the blood. But you do also have a significant amount being carried as carbonic or as bicarbonate ion. So the CO2 is going to come in, react with water, forming carbonic acid. This is facilitated by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which is going to rapidly dissociate to bicarbonate ion and H+. So you have bicarbonate ion being a significant portion of that. Another thing that can happen is that the CO2 can bind to hemoglobin, and you can have carbaminohemoglobin being produced. So this is just hemoglobin with the carbon dioxide bound to it. Now, this is going to come into a relationship with oxygen, since hemoglobin also carries oxygen. Hemoglobin that's saturated with O2 does not readily bind to CO2. But when O2 is not bound to the heme, the partial pressure of oxygen is low, hemoglobin readily binds to the CO2. So if you take oxygen to places where the concentration of O2 is low, it's going to diffuse away from the hemoglobin, and the CO2 is going to be able to be picked up and transported that way. So, 3 ways that carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. One is the dissolved CO2. So that's one of them. Another is the bicarbonate ion. And then the third way is as carbaminohemoglobin. If we look at hemoglobin, we see that it has 4 binding sites for oxygen. So each of those are going to be a heme group that you have in there. So hemoglobin shows cooperativity. So binding of one O2 molecule at one of these sites is going to actually increase the affinity for oxygen at these other sites, so that you have positive cooperativity going on. So saturation, or when all the binding sites are occupied, which is going to be close to 100% in healthy individuals. The oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve is going to be such that you have the concentration of O2 in the tissues being lower, so you have only about a 75% O2 saturation there. The lungs, it's going to be much closer to 100%. And so what you're really looking at here is the difference between those 2 points. So the volume of O2 in the that is unloaded is the difference between these 2 concentrations. Certain hormones, such as epinephrine and thyroid hormone, can affect this oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, mainly by stimulating the production of 2,3-BPG, or bisphosphoglycerate. This is a byproduct of glycolysis, which promotes dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. Factors other than the partial pressure and the BPG also affect the dissociation curve. Higher temperatures, for example, can affect it in causing oxygen to dissociate faster, whereas a lower temperature is going to inhibit the dissociation. But because the human body is going to tightly associate this, the partial pressure of oxygen is going to be the most important. So partial pressure of oxygen, we can see it at these different temperatures and how that will affect it. But overall, the partial pressure of oxygen is going to be the most important. All right, the Bohr effect. So lower, more acidic pH promotes oxygen dissociation from hemoglobin. In contrast, more basic pH is going to inhibit oxygen dissociation. So this is going to be important because of what happens to the local pH in the tissues versus the lungs. So the normal pH of 7.4, you have this binding curve, but if you have a higher pH, you're going to see that the curve shifts to the left. So that means that it's going to take a lower partial pressure of oxygen for that to bind to the same amount. Whereas here, in order to get to that same percentage. So if we're looking at the 50% binding curve here, we'll see that this, not very good at drawing straight lines, is going to be rightward shifted as we go down in pH. So this ultimately, where you're going to have higher pHs, is where you're going to have more CO2, meaning that the O2 is going to have less of an affinity for oxygen or hemoglobin at those sites. So in the tissues, you're dropping off the O2, picking up carbon dioxide, where in the lungs, you're dropping off the CO2, picking up the oxygen and delivering it to the tissue. So this is more associated with the lungs, and this is the tissues, thus helping facilitate the movement of carbon dioxide and oxygen. One other thing to consider is the hemoglobin of the fetus. So the fetus is different from the normal humans in that it is not getting its oxygen directly from its lungs, but it's getting its oxygen from the mother's circulation. So because of this, you have to have a higher affinity for the oxygen than the adult. And so you see that the fetal hemoglobin is going to actually be leftward shifted here, meaning that it has a higher affinity. It takes a lower partial pressure of oxygen to become 50% saturated than it does with the parents. And those lines are drawn, and you see it even more greatly affected as you get over to this higher partial pressures. Thus, the fetus is able to overcome the problem by having a greater affinity for oxygen than the maternal hemoglobin and takes the oxygen from the mother's hemoglobin. All right, the final process in respiration is going to be internal respiration. This is when O2 is going to diffuse from the blood to the tissue cells, and CO2 is going to diffuse from the tissue cells to the blood. So we're going to see a reverse of what was going on in the lungs. So the CO2 is coming from the tissues, binding to the hemoglobin here. So you have carbaminohemoglobin being produced. It helps if I have color that's different than the red behind there. You have some of it reacting with the help of carbonic anhydrase to forming bicarbonate ion, oxygen, and then finally some of it is going to just be dissolved in the blood as CO2. Oxygen, on the other hand, is going to be moving from the blood to the tissues as it unbinds from the hemoglobin. All right, one other process that's closely related to this, but not an actual process that occurs in the respiratory system, is going to be cellular respiration. So this is a function of metabolism and not a function of the respiratory system, but this is essentially where the tissues are going to consume the oxygen to make ATP, and as a consequence of that, produce the CO2. So that is where that's coming from. That has been an overview of the respiratory system and the different processes that make it up. In the next video, we'll look at some of the major structures of the respiratory system.